Good morning, everyone. Can I welcome you to the 22nd meeting in 2012 of the Infrastructure and Capital Investment Committee. Can I remind everyone to switch off their mobile phones and Blackberries and devices because they affect the broadcasting system. Agenda item 1 is business and private. Can I seek the agreement of the committee to take agenda item 4 in private? That's our approach to the scrutiny of an LCM relating to the Marine Navigation Number 2 bill. Are members agreed to take this in private? That is agreed, thank you. The second item is MAX and PVS annual reports. We are going to take evidence from the Mobility and Access Committee for Scotland and Passengers Views Scotland in connection with their annual reports for 2011-12. So can I welcome in front of the committee today Anne McLean, convener, and Jane Hosper, committee member from MAX, and from PVS I welcome Hugh Flynn, acting chair, and Professor Colin Reid, committee member. Could I invite the witnesses to make some opening remarks? Who's going first?
My colleague from PBS is going first.
Thank you, convener. I'd like to just briefly update members regarding the 3 recommendations in our annual report, and also just comment briefly on our current membership situation and on the good practice guide for bus operators. The first of our recommendations relates to the need, as part of the Rail 2014 process, for in our view, for the Scottish Government to ensure that a mechanism is maintained to get passengers' views regularly on a much wider basis than the current passenger survey done by Passenger Focus allows. The current Passenger Focus survey tends to cover about 1,000 passengers in Scotland, and we consider that in order to for the Scottish Government to have information on passenger satisfaction and priorities on a route-specific basis, a much larger sample of opinion is needed. There is no reason why the Scottish Government can't pay for Passenger Focus to undertake a wider survey. We have discussed this with Passenger Focus, who in principle are quite happy, and we also have been in discussion with the Transport Scotland officials who are leading on passenger issues as part of the Rail 2014 process. And we really await their recommendations. I understand they have a draft report with the Minister, which we haven't yet seen. On the second recommendation, which relates to a second-tier complaints mechanism for ferry passengers, there has been a development on this in that there are now EU passenger regulations due to come into force next month, on which the Scottish Government has had the opportunity to comment, and those regulations will require the Scottish Government to have a second-tier complaints mechanism for people who are dissatisfied with the response they get from operators. And we welcome that, but do consider that, particularly because the Scottish Government owns the main ferries operator, that there does need to be an independent mechanism for that. And obviously we have experience in relation to bus complaints in fulfilling that role, so we'd be happy to be involved in that. The final recommendation arises from a report that we did on integration of public transport in relation to the Airdrie-Bathgate line, where we felt that there had not been sufficient advanced planning, hence the recommendation. Because the next major public transport development where this will be an issue is the Waverley line, we did send our report to the Transport Scotland project team dealing with the Waverley line, and we had a very positive response saying that one of the key objectives of the New Borders railway line was integration with local bus services, and there was a formal commitment between Midlothian, Scottish Borders and Scottish ministers to put this into effect. Obviously the proof of the pudding will be in the eating, but the response has been positive so far. On page 3 of our report, we refer to our current membership situation, which has impeded us in putting a forward work programme together. We should have a convener and 11 members. For well over a year now, we've only had 8. And on the 31st of March next year, 7 of the 8 members will come to the end of their terms. We understand that a review has been undertaken into PVS, and that the results of that review have been with the Minister for several months now. But we don't know what is being recommended, and are therefore unable to plan our work beyond the next 4 months. Finally, can I just refer to the Good Practice Guide for bus operators, where we've been frustrated by the reluctance of the UK Confederation of Passenger Transport, that's the bus operators body, to agree to the Good Practice Guide that we've negotiated with the Confederation of Passenger Transport, the bus operators in Scotland. We have agreement with them, but the UK body are reluctant to agree to a distinct Scottish Good Practice Guide for bus operators. The Minister kindly indicated his willingness to raise this issue with his UK counterpart. We have regarded that very much as a last resort, but unfortunately we have not been able to make any progress with discussions at the UK level, so we have now asked the Minister to intervene. Thanks very much.
Okay, thanks for that. We've got the Minister coming to us in a fortnight, on the 12th of December anyway, and we'll raise the issue that you have raised with us. We'll make a note to do that with him. Who's it going, Anne or Jane?
It's me.
Okay.
Well, thank you for seeing us. I'd just like to start by, I suppose, reminding people that for somebody with a disability travelling, the moment starts that you put your foot or your wheel on the pavement until you get where you've reached. It is the whole journey. And for people with disability, any break in that whole journey for whatever reason can lead to sometimes quite distressing circumstances. And I have to say, there's 15 recommendations in our annual report, but 2 of them are really good, and I would like to highlight those. You will probably know that there was a lot of complaints about the drop-off charges starting for blue badge holders at Edinburgh Airport after a quarter of an hour. And we went to see the airport, and I have to say, after had a meeting of 3 or 4 hours with them, and the following day they extended that quarter of an hour to half an hour for blue badge holders. That was a real success for Max, and we were really pleased. Not only that, I have to say, but the publicity that BAA, who at that time owned Edinburgh Airport, put out, paid tribute to Max's work and the constructive way in which we'd worked with them. And I think that's an excellent example of us working with stakeholders. And I think another example was when the work was going on at Waverley, and during some part of that work, taxis were excluded from Waverley Station. We went to see Network Rail, and again we had a lot of discussions with them, and they improved the signage, they put yellow lines on humps, and they reminded taxi drivers that there could be pick-up at, that there was a pick-up point at New Street Car Park. And I believe, and I can't prove this, but I had a long conversation with Network Rail the day before they had their final meeting with Edinburgh City Council about excluding taxis permanently from Waverley. And I wasn't going to go all over the whole thing about what that does to the disabled traveller. I'm afraid I was a bit more unkind and just reminded them how much extra money it cost to provide all the extra assistance from 2 points that are quite far away from the main concourse. And I'm not saying it was that broke the camel's back, so to speak, but I do think that was another good, and we've got a really good result. We don't know yet how the taxi system is going to work in Waverley, but it's certainly going to be, anything has to be an improvement from, excluding them completely. We have, I think, quite an exciting forward work programme. We're going to do much more work with planners, with the regional transport partnerships, and with all the other airports. And I have to say that's quite a challenge, because if you look at the airports at Barra and Benbecula, I'm not sure how you get disabled access, but we'll deal with that when we come to it. If you're going to eat an elephant, start with a small one. And, you know, so we're going to be doing that. We're still monitoring the whole Blue Badge situation. We're hoping to work with Visit Scotland, who've done a study on accessible tourism, and they consulted disabled people across Scotland. But the one thing that wasn't part of their remit was transport, you know, for disabled people. And everyone, at every conference, raised the fact that accessible tourism has got to include transport. So we're hoping, after a conference in March next year, that we might be able to engage with Visit Scotland, which will be a new venture for us. But transport is very important for the tourist industry. And we're also, there's other, you know, obviously we've got our ongoing work, and we appeared before you, as you know, on Rail 2014, and we're hoping to have discussions with the franchise team when that is settled, to discuss, you know, disability awareness, disability access in the new franchise. So I think we've got a very positive message.
Thank you very much, Anne. Jim, Edie, you're going to start off the questioning today, but thank goodness for the result at Waverley. It was bothering us all. Jim, do you want to start with that?
Yes, thank you. And in fact, that was the first point I wanted to make. As an Edinburgh MSP, I was very concerned at the attempt to ban taxis from Waverley. So I'd like to begin by congratulating Mobility and Access, the Mobility and Access Committee for Scotland, for their successful campaign to overturn the permanent ban. So I think that is a very good illustration of the positive and constructive role that your organisation can play. But what I'd like to understand better from both organisations is the relationship that you have with Transport Scotland. I know that one of your organisations actually occupies the same building as Transport Scotland, so that implies perhaps a close relationship. But I'm interested in knowing whether they proactively seek the views of your organisations when it comes to accessibility issues before they issue consultations more widely and before they actually make important decisions on major projects. So if you could give us a little bit more information on how you see that relationship working and how it could be improved.
I will speak for Max, if I may. I have seen a big improvement over the past 6 months or so. And I'll give you an example. My colleague from PVS mentioned the European regulations on the rights of passengers when travelling by sea or inland waterways. And we commented to the UK government through DIPTAC on, the Disabled Persons Transport Advisory Committee, on which Max has a seat. Because obviously it's EU legislation, so the consultation came from the UK government. But Transport Scotland was also a consultee, and I got in touch with them to say that I didn't mind, because we mentioned this two-tier complaint system, Max didn't mind who took this next level of complaint. But I wanted to ensure that it was going to be accessible to disabled people across the whole range of disabilities, because there is a lot of, and I'm not saying in transport, but there's a lot of complaints procedures that a lot of disabled people just can't access freely and properly. And the ferries team in Transport Scotland would like Max's input into how that complaints procedure might work, whether or not it's just going to cover ferries or whether it's going to cover ferries and other boats and tour boat. You know what I mean? What do I mean? Cruise ships. Cruise ships. That's the word I'm looking for. Yes, the brain's gone too much. Sorry. Cruise ships that's not. We had no real comment about that, but I do want a process that's going to be accessible to disabled people, and they're willing to talk to us about that, and I think that's very good. And I have to say, on Blue Badge, because we're monitoring it, we've had some quite constructive discussions with the Blue Badge team. Very constructive. So I think we're getting there. And we're hoping to start working with planners on, the infrastructure stuff. And we're hoping not just, we had the Chief Planning Officer come to to one of our meetings and talk to us. And we're hoping to do more work with planners across Scotland. And there's 33 planning authorities plus one that's an oddity, because there's 32 local authorities and 2 national parks. And we want to be able to work with all of them.
Do you want to add anything?
Yes, I'd echo what Anne said, but just add a couple of points. The first is that the Secretariat for both our bodies is in fact provided by the staff from Transport Scotland. So it's, almost by definition we have a close working relationship. But in terms of the more positive approach, on the Rail 2014 process, Max and ourselves were invited to a meeting by members of the franchise team, and we actually had a very positive, almost 3-hour meeting discussing passenger issues, accessibility issues, and what we would want to see in that regard in the franchise. So yes, the relationship is a good one.
How often do you meet with Transport Scotland?
That's difficult to say for Max. We invite various people to come and address our meetings, and it isn't always Transport Scotland, because you know, there are other parts of the Scottish Government with which we need to have a relationship. I'll give you an example. The Audit Commission report on transport for health and social work. We had the staff doing the audit, you know, from Audit Scotland coming to talk to us, because we wanted to ensure that we could get into, you know, whatever came out of that report. And in fact, both PVS and ourselves are waiting for, because we had a representative on one of the working groups, and we're waiting for the Minister for Health to make an announcement on the outcome of that. And I have met the Chief Executive of Transport Scotland twice, and we do have, again, if you refer to our annual report, there's various bits of Transport Scotland and other organisations have come to talk to us, you know, like Glasgow 2014, for instance, because the Max is, that's I think why I said it's, you know, from the beginning of the journey right to the end, and that does involve a lot of other parts of the Scottish Government, not just Transport Scotland.
I think we'll come on to 2014 maybe later. Jim, any further questions?
Yes, can you outline how your 2 organisations work together, and how do you avoid duplication between your roles and those of other groups that represent disabled passengers, such as the Disabled Persons Transport Advisory Committee?
DIPTAC deals with purely things that are the responsibility of the UK government. We work with PVS. PVS send an observer to Max, and we send an observer to PVS. And therefore there is a good interchange. And you know, we can give you examples where we're well, we just talked about ferries, but demand responsive transport, and the very thing I've just mentioned about the Audit Scotland report on transport for health and social work. We've worked very closely with one another on those subjects, as we did when we appeared before you on the Rail 2014 franchise, and as Hugh has just said, you know, a meeting with the franchise team that both Max and PVS were present at. So we work very well together. Although we obviously have slightly different remits.
I confirm that. We certainly have a very close working relationship with Max. The other main body that we relate to is Passenger Focus, the UK body in relation to rail passengers. They now send a member of their staff to all our meetings. And obviously, because they have the resources that we don't have to undertake passenger surveys, we talk to them about what goes in the surveys and all of that sort of thing. So, yes, in terms of Max and Passenger Focus, we have a very constructive relationship.
Just finally, and for completeness, in terms of your representations to the Scottish Government? Are you satisfied that the points that you've been making in consultations have been taken on board and acted upon by the Scottish Government? I know there's a number of issues that are outstanding that you're waiting for a response from the Minister on, but generally and over the piece, how have you found that relationship?
Yes, generally good. I mean, as you've said, we are waiting for a response on issues such as rail passenger surveys, but we expect that because we know what process is going on, and we know we will get a response in due course. So yes, generally we are very happy with responses that we get. The only issue that has been one of concern is the one I mentioned about our own membership and ongoing role.
Professor Reid, did you want to come in on that point?
No.
Okay.
I think a lot of our recommendations refer not necessarily to the Scottish Government, but to other bodies, like the Commonwealth Games team, like the Health Department on the Audit Commission report, like operators or, well, organisations like BAA that we have at least had a successful outcome with, and we'll be dealing with organisations like Highlands and Islands Airports Limited on the other, because they have 11 of the airports of the 14 in Scotland. So when it's not necessarily the Scottish Government per se. Quite a lot of what we need to do is persuade operators and providers to see us as a useful source of advice and help.
Okay. If I could ask, I think someone did mention that the UK Government is considering the abolition of DIPTAG, as you call it. What's your view on this proposal, and how might it impact on your work?
I wrote in the introduction to the annual report this year that it's still all up in the air, and the challenge for us will be to build a relationship with whatever body replaces it. It seems to me to be no doubt that DIPTAG is going, and we have contributed, as has Passenger View Scotland, to every consultation on the winding up of DIPTAG, and it will not come to any surprise to hear that we have tried as convincingly as we can to show them that actually it's not nearly as expensive as they've been trying to make out, and that it is a very efficient body. It is becoming less efficient because, again, they're not filling posts as they, through the public appointment system as they fall, and they've vacant, and they've also reduced the secretariat support that they get. I think it would be, this is Max's view, we believe it would be a great loss if DIPTAG went, because it is actually able to cover the range of disabilities. I think one of the things, and actually I have to say the UK government has picked this up as well, that anything that replaces it could well end up being led by pressure groups of one sort or another. And one of the things I will say about non-departmental public bodies and their appointment system is that I think it avoids that.
I
Yes,
think
Professor Reid.
the one extra thing I'd say is that we were disappointed in the consultation because it seemed to suggest that all consultation, all discussion about disability issues had to go through one forum, whereas the reality obviously is that you're going to have, for different projects, different scales of works, different sorts of relationships, sometimes focused consultancy, sometimes dealing with pressure groups, sometimes dealing with small groups. What DIPTAG offers is the guarantee of across-the-board scrutiny and the ability to join up issues, to see where actually, well, this is the third time this point has come up in different contexts, and obviously there's a generic thing to do there. So that would be a further loss. Not that everything has to or should go through DIPTAG, but it has an important role to play as a backstop and taking an overview.
Okay. Did you want to come in, Jane? Yeah.
I will.
Yes.
But just to be clear about DIPTAG, it does deal with the UK issues, and equality and therefore accessibility standards are actually down at the UK. So if we don't have anybody to liaise with and get involved with, it's unclear how we are up here going to be able to feed in. and also for the European legislation that comes over, it does go there first. And although we're involved in it, we don't always lead on it. So in the future, we will have to have a discussion depending on how they take DIPTAC forward.
Okay, if we move on to the blue badge, eligibility for that, for some people, is dependent on receipt of the higher rate of the mobility component of disability living allowance. What impact might the proposals in the UK Welfare Reform Bill have on the operation of the blue badge scheme in Scotland?
Yes, that would be fine, thank you.
Hello. This has been taken up with the government and it's passported benefits. There will, with the reform, there could have an impact, and blue badges could be, in theory, taken away. There is a lot of work happening within the government just now, and we and Max have a sort of watching brief over that and an engagement with the reform group, but they're working on how they can actually retain some of that, not some of that, but they're trying to retain it. We don't know as yet what will be in its place, but I would just like to reiterate it is actually a worry to people out there, and it's more and more getting vocal about it. In Wales, I believe they're actually consulting, the Assembly's consulting on this issue, and again trying to find a way where they can retain the same level of eligibility, perhaps just by a different means.
Okay, that's maybe something we can also bring up with the Minister on the 12th. Anyone else want to comment on that bit? No. Okay, the Edinburgh-Glasgow Improvement Project will require the purchase of a large fleet of new electric trains. Have you had any discussions with Transport Scotland on the specification of these trains and a view to establishing the best possible level of accessibility for these?
Not yet. But Max sits on the Scottish Rail Accessibility Forum, and EGIP, or however you pronounce it, comes up at that regularly. So I have no doubt that we will have an opportunity to have some influence, I hope.
Also not yet. I mean, I have attended, along with the Max member who's leading on Egypt, a stakeholders meeting, but beyond that we've had no direct dialogue about the issue you raised.
Okay, thanks. Margaret?
Good morning. My two questions is actually towards PVS. My first question is, how does PVS gather the views of passengers to ensure it accurately represents their interests to the Scottish Government?
I'm afraid the answer to that, notwithstanding our title, is not directly, because we simply do not have the resources that enable us to undertake surveys. So we are reliant. I've mentioned the passenger focus and the input we have into the survey that they do, and our proposal that that survey should be widened to cover a much larger number of passengers in Scotland. We're also in discussion with Passenger Focus about bus passengers. Again, we do not have the resources to undertake surveys of bus users ourselves. In 2010, Passenger Focus were given a statutory responsibility in relation to bus passengers in England outside London, and they have started doing annual surveys, although they haven't yet, they're gradually expanding to cover the whole of England. They haven't yet done so. At our last meeting, we did talk with Passenger Focus about whether, in principle, it could be possible for, although obviously buses are devolved, they have the resources to undertake surveys, and the most cost-effective way of covering passengers in Scotland would probably be for their survey to cover Scotland. It's one of the main elements in our work programme for the next 4 months, is to see what can be done on that front and hopefully make recommendations to the Minister. There may be an issue about legal powers for Passenger Focus, but so yes, as I say, I'm afraid the answer to you is not directly, but we are very much aware of the need for this and we are pursuing it.
Okay,
Perhaps the other route is through BPP, bus passengers platform, the direct complaints means that the number and the nature of the complaints comes in is monitored, and if anything significant emerges from that, we pick it up, as well as the fact that we're fairly scattered across Scotland and all read the local press, which tends to be a very good way of picking up major issues.
Excellent, thank you. And my next question as well is to PVS. The UK Government has halted work in all passenger franchising exercises following the collapse of the award of Intercity West Coast franchise. What implications might this have for Scottish rail passengers?
When that happened, I did write directly to the member of the franchise team that we're liaising with and asked precisely that question. The answer was, in essence, that the timetable they are following enables them to take account of the outcome of the 2 reviews that the UK government has initiated. Yes, we have talked about the implications to Transport Scotland, but it does not appear, subject to the result of these 2 reviews, that it will impact directly on the timescale for the Scottish franchise.
Okay, thank you.
Could I direct my questions to Max in particular? You highlight in your report that you're not being supplied with sufficient information to properly assess proposed improvements to railway stations, and indeed the Scottish Rail Accessibility Forum has the same difficulty. What additional information are you looking for, and who's responsible for providing it for you, or not, as the case may be?
Well, at the moment, what happens at the Scottish Rail Accessibility Forum is that we are merely told what stations they're going to upgrade. We don't get much rationale as to why various stations have been picked. And incidentally, can I just say, Max does not want to sit down and get into an argument as to whether it's, I don't know, Aviemore or, I don't know, somewhere, Stonehaven. Just use those 2 as an example. That's not what we want to. We want to know the rationale behind upgrading certain stations, and we don't get that information. But hot off the press, yesterday I got a phone call from our representative on the Scottish Rail Accessibility Forum, and they're going to have discussions on how the money's going to be spent. It will be in I've got my years wrong, 13-14, in advance of us being told. Now, we don't know how that's going to work yet, but it's a step in the right direction, and I don't look gift horses in the mouth. So that is, it does show that, if you approach a problem the right way, you sometimes get the results. But the proof of the pudding is going to be in the eating. But I'm really hopeful. And that was just yesterday that we heard that. So that's really good.
Can I ask, do you have a list of stations that are priorities, if you like, for action in terms of making them more accessible?
I wouldn't want to be hanged, I have to tell you. I don't think that's our role. I think our role is to get the rationale behind where the money is being spent, and look at where money has been spent and whether it has actually achieved the improvement that was said, if you follow me. Now, you can't do that if you don't know what the rationale is behind why they've spent the money in Dunblane. Again, I'll just give you an example. Because unless we know the rationale as to why that station was picked, then it's very difficult then to monitor and see whether the outcome is what was expected. That's what we're there for. I don't think Max would ever want to be. I think we would end up fighting among the 12 of us as to which station should be upgraded. Please, miss, I want Aviemore dealt with, or whatever. And I don't think that's our role.
Can I ask about the access for all approach that the UK government and the Scottish government support. I think the Scottish Government had indicated that the Awards for All programme had made a substantial difference, and it's in discussions with the UK Government to continue it after 2014. Do you think that this is the best approach?
I think I'd probably give you the same answer to that question as I gave you to the last one. Because, again, can I say from Mac's point of view, it's not where the money comes from, it's how it's spent, and is the outcome a valuable one and a useful one, rather than, you know, which pot the money comes out of. But anything that can be done to upgrade stations has to be good. But I think we all recognise that, you know, I would like to, well, you will see from our annual report, we actually said, sort of hopefully, that by the end of the next ScotRail franchise, we hoped every station in Scotland would be accessible. That's probably wishing for a bit much, but if you don't aim high, you're not going to get. And in some, I am sure, and this is not our expertise, and I wouldn't pretend that it was, but I am sure that on some stations, a very small spend would make a considerable difference. Whereas in other stations, you would need a big spend to make the difference. Now, a lot of that depends on footfall. I have absolutely no doubt about this. But coming back to the whole thing that I was saying about tourism, for instance, and encouraging people to use public transport, and that includes trains, a lot of the stations that are beautiful to look at, but actually not very accessible, are in tourist areas. You know, they're in, but they don't have a big footfall, but they're very important to the tourist industry. And that sort of thing has got to come together somehow.
Anyone else got a view on the access for all being the appropriate approach, or are there other suggestions that are other? Yep. Jane?
Thank you. The access for all, just to be clear, it is about making train stations step-free accessible. It doesn't proclaim to actually make all the stations' environment accessible. It is actually about step-free. And they did do a report and research to actually say that it has made a big improvement across the network. Where it, because of that approach, it is slightly let down, would be on those people that have a sensory loss, the hearing loss, sight loss. But in saying that, it was never aimed for that. It was to make train stations step-free. If we ever find out the rationale for how they choose, but it's important, we might be able to put a bit more information around that. But the Small Works Fund is another fund that they can then make some of the smaller changes that Anne was actually saying. But it seems to have made a big difference for people with a mobility issue as for step-free.
So how far away are we in terms of making railway stations accessible?
I couldn't possibly say. It's taken this to here to get train stations step-free, or as many as can be.
Yeah.
But it is interesting when you talk about the new line, you know, the Borders line. Now, that's a way where we can get in early and make sure that it's like that from the beginning, and it's not just step-free, that it covers all other disabilities. Cognitive problems, learning difficulties, sensory deprivation, you know, all of that. That they're all taken on board because we're starting afresh. And it seems to me, not only is that a good opportunity, but it could be a sort of exemplar for what could be done elsewhere.
About starting afresh, you've obviously you have some asks with regards to the ScotRail franchise for 2014. Are you satisfied that the issues that you're raising are being addressed satisfactorily as part of the franchise process? And what are the key practical issues you would like to see addressed in the next franchise?
Well, I think if you look at our written evidence and our oral evidence to this committee when we discussed the Rail 2014, and it's encapsulated in our annual report, that everything we said there is what we expect, you know, as a disability. But sorry, Hugh and Muriel Masson, our representative who deals with rail, have had some discussions with the franchise team, and in fact, Max is going to write to them, merely talking about the whole range of issues that are covered by the specific and general duties. Sorry, on the disability side, I don't mean all 9 of the identified areas for equality and human rights, but we are going to write to them specifically about the disabilities, and saying that on top of what we've already said in our written and oral evidence, that we expect the disability part of that and the specific and general duties to meet the requirements that those put on people, because we assume that whoever gets franchise, it's a private body, but it's providing a public service with public money, that it would have to meet the general and the specific duties under the legislation.
To add to that, we made a very full response to the Rail 2014 consultation, and it's summarised on pages 9 to 11 of our annual report, and that sets out what our key priorities and concerns are. In terms of the response we've had, we are awaiting. We understand that the franchise has been, the process has been broken down into a number of working groups. I think there's 32 of them looking at different areas of policy in relation to the franchise. We understand the one which is most concern to us, the passenger experience. We understand that a submission has been made to the Minister on this. I think I said earlier. We haven't seen it yet. We wouldn't expect to until the Minister's had a look at it. So until we do, we can't say with confidence to what extent our particular points, particularly around passenger surveys and monitoring of passenger experience, have been taken on board. But the general feedback we've had is positive.
I think that's something we can take up with the Minister as well, I suppose. Thank you.
Okay, if we move on, Gordon MacDonald.
Thanks very much, Convener. I want to ask questions about the PVS annual report. And Hugh, you very helpfully laid out background to the 3 recommendations you made in that report. So you highlighted that the existing rail passenger monitoring covers the views of around 1,000 passengers, and it's carried out by Passenger Focus Scotland, Passenger Focus. You've suggested that this isn't a large enough sample. Given that there's 78 million rail passengers in Scotland in the last year I could get stats for 2010-11, what size of sample should there be to get a meaningful satisfaction survey, and what organisation do you think is best placed to carry out that survey?
I'd hesitate to project a precise number.
Should it be 5,000, 10,000, 15,000?
Off the top of my head, I would think we'd have to be talking about 5,000 at least. The UK survey covers 5,000 passengers. But as I said, although the sample in Scotland is, it's reasonable at 1,000 in terms of the national picture, and in terms of it's sufficiently large to be able to have a gender breakdown and a breakdown between key categories of rail transport like urban, rural and so on. But if you're going to have a route-specific feedback, because obviously passengers, say, on the Inverness-Kyle line will have very different experience from commuter passengers in the Glasgow area. if you're going to get that sort of breakdown, you do need a significantly larger sample.
I mean, you've highlighted you have some concerns about future monitoring. Is it purely about route-by-route monitoring, or is there anything else you've got concerns about? Basically, I'm just asking the question, have you any concerns about how we carry out future monitoring?
Well, one issue, for example, which we raised in our submission is on the monitoring of lateness, which has been done primarily in relation to arrival at destination, but not so much in terms of monitoring along the way. You know, a train might be on time when it gets to Glasgow from Aberdeen, but that doesn't mean that it was on time at various intermediate destinations. So certainly there could be better monitoring in that regard. That's just an example.
You also asked that the Scottish Government establish a new second-tier complaints handling body for ferry passengers, and you explained that new EU regulations required a complaints procedure. Who should provide this service, and have you any idea how much it would cost to set this up?
I mean, the EU regulations, in the consultation response, the UK government said, after liaising with Transport Scotland, that the responsibility should be with the Scottish government. And obviously, at an overall level, that's the case. We feel, as I said earlier, that there has to be an independent element to that, which could be provided by us, but not necessarily so. The independent element is critical because of the Scottish Government's ownership position in relation to CalMac. In terms of the cost, no, well, I can't give you an answer to that.
And just my last question, you also asked that a duty be placed on public bodies to plan and encourage bus rail integration where there are new or substantial change rail services. Now, given that ScotRail is operated by First Group and many bus routes are also operated by First Group, why do you think they have not integrated services?
That is a very interesting question, and if we look at the second part of our recommendation, it addresses that issue. When we embarked on the Airdrie-Bathgate report, I naively thought that the fact that you've mentioned would make coordination and integration between bus services and rail services easier. It turns out that the situation is quite the reverse. I was advised by both officials from both First Bus and West Lothian Council that requirements of the Office of Fair Trading actually mean that in order, as the OFT would see it, that the bus operator isn't at an unfair advantage by virtue of also being the rail operator, they couldn't simply make the adjustments to their timetables that would enable direct transfer to take place with minimum delay. So it's a strange situation. Anecdotally, I have heard that there have been problems also in East Lothian and in relation to the Alloa line. So it is an issue, and our submission to the Scottish Government, we suggested that they look into it, and if they confirm that it is indeed an issue, as it appears to be, the matter should be raised, whether with the OFT, the UK Government, or the Competition Commission.
And given that the problem is with the OFT, any new duty that's introduced by the Scottish Government, what would that achieve, bearing in mind the rulings from the OFT?
Well, I mean, the problem is that competition legislation is a reserved matter. I mean, we can really only suggest that representations are made. I don't think there are any direct powers that the Scottish Government has.
No direct powers, but there are other things you can do. I mean, the integration, that is one aspect of it. Other things are simply, where's the bus stop? Is it accessible? Does it fit easily? So there are aspects of the integration you can do that can improve the situation, even if you do still have this competition problem.
Thanks very much.
Okay, Alex?
Thank you, Cynthia.
My questions are really for PVS and they relate to the bus passenger platform. We've seen the breakdown of figures in relation to complaints. So my first question is, do you think that the system for resolving bus passenger complaints is fit for purpose, given that the vast majority of complaints to the bus passenger platform were not within the scope of the agency?
I think, unfortunately, neither of us has had direct involvement with BPP, which is partly because of the constitutional structure, which is that PVS is the appeal body from bus passenger platform. So we take a hands-off approach rather than getting involved in looking at the individual papers, so that we have independence when we look at them. I think there's a range of things why cases aren't within power. The fact that so many of them that come through are eventually resolved by simply speaking to the bus companies and so on suggests that there is an element of confusion about where you go with bus complaints. There are problems with what is the responsibility of the Transport Commissioner, what are ours, what are simply matters to be dealt with immediately with the bus company. And I suspect it would be easier for everybody if there was an overall simpler situation. But complaints in this area is one that is a difficult one because you have this public-private divide that to some extent the buses are seen very much as a public service. Therefore, elements of the complaints mechanisms for the public sector are represented, but you're dealing with private operators who obviously are in a very different position. So I think that there is scope for improvement across the board here. But the very small number of cases that are coming through to us as the appeal body, the very small number of cases actually requiring a formal resolution, I think suggests that there is a lot of good work being done.
What sanctions can BPP impose on a bus operator that fails to resolve legitimate passenger complaints?
None directly. There is in the SSI that created us, we have the power to require an operator to provide compensation, which I don't think we've ever got to the stage of doing. And how we actually require them is, I find, quite interesting. What would, do we send them a bill? Do we send them an invoice? How would that then be enforced by whom and such like? As an academic administrative lawyer, I find the whole BPP system fascinating as an example, as a hybrid system that perhaps might have been thought out a bit more carefully to begin with.
Exploring that system a little bit more, what can BPP do, if anything, to assist bus operators with a view to avoiding complaints being made in the first place?
Well, I think the two things that we are, one is the Good Practice Guide, which has been working with the operators in Scotland, trying to make sure that they know what's expected of them and they do things properly. Over the years, BPP have reported, the Secretary has reported that they've built up very good relations with a number of the bus companies. The situation has changed where, partly because of BPP's existence and getting involved, they have improved hugely their internal complaint systems, as opposed to at some stages BPP were having to write more than once to get a proper response from the bus companies. They're now geared, set up, so that complaints are dealt with properly internally, and there's now very little for us to do in relation to some of the companies. So but the bus companies do vary.
Yeah, so basically BPP can operate at a fairly interactive level and assist in making sure that the level of legitimate complaint is lower than it otherwise would be.
Yes, I think the small number of cases that are requiring formal decision is a sign of the effectiveness we've had in dealing with the operators.
Okay, yeah.
I just wonder, can you tell us a wee bit more about the Good Practice Guide and for bus operators and what it actually covers? What's the good practice it covers? Is it purely in terms of in relationship to the kind of service that people are actually getting, or can it cover things like, if a community wants an extra bus service in its area? What's the remit?
Well, I can take you through the, if you like, the headlines in the Good Practice Guide. It covers the passenger experience before they're even on the bus or coach. It covers the quality of facilities and the level of information provided, both at bus stops and in bus stations. It covers the conduct, for want of a better word, of drivers and inspectors. It covers the quality of buses in terms of cleanliness, heating, ventilation, and so on. It covers the means of paying for a journey, and it covers punctuality and reliability. So in terms of the specific question you raise about, the demand for a bus service, that isn't really something that the Good Practice Guide would cover, as it stands at the moment.
But is it being adopted? What is the problem that you described at the outset with regards to the...
The problem is that we have a good working relationship with the Confederation of Passenger Transport for Scotland, which is the bus operator's umbrella body. We discuss the code of practice intensively with them, and it has been agreed. They do not feel able to, as it were, sign up on the dotted line without the consent of the UK Confederation of Passenger Transport, of which they are a part. And it's that consent that has not been forthcoming. We understand the issue is a reluctance on the part of the UK CPT to have a distinct code for one part of the UK. We couldn't agree more.
But are companies operating in Scotland adopting the Good Practice Guide as a matter of course? Is it just a...
I mean, not in a formal sense, but I would certainly say that the major bus operators, broadly speaking, do respect it.
All right. Is there anything else that you would like to add? Anne, you were talking a bit about your interaction on the Commonwealth Games. Would you like to say a bit more about that?
Yes. The last time we appeared before a committee, and it wasn't this one, it was at the Equal Opportunities Committee, the Commonwealth Games scene was fairly sad, I have to say, because although we contributed to a consultation document, you wouldn't have known it, because they didn't print any of our comments, nor did they, although they casually mentioned in the front that we had contributed without putting any of them in. Things have greatly improved, I have to say. We had Commonwealth Games, members of the Commonwealth Games Glasgow team come to a meeting during the period of the report, and since then they have set up a Commonwealth Games accessibility reference group on which Max has a seat. They have one accessibility manager. We would doubt that that is enough, but that's something that they have to deal with. They're spending the money. But we are concerned that they're concentrating solely on Glasgow, and there are another 4 sites, which I won't. If I could read them, I would tell you. Yes, there's the Strathclyde Country Park, there's the Jackton Shooting Range in South Lanarkshire, there's the Barry Budden, I think that's what it says, Shooting Centre, and there's the Commonwealth Pool in Edinburgh, of course. And we want to ensure that all those venues are dealt with the same way as the main, Commonwealth Games centres in Glasgow. They've had 3 meetings, and I think our concern is that there's a lot of people with a finger in that pie, and one person, their accessibility manager, and this is no criticism of that individual. I'm just saying that the Olympics had something like 12, and I know it was much bigger. I'm not arguing about that, but it seems for one person to deal with all these issues is rather a lot. We'd like to see them put a bit more into it. But yes, it's vastly improved from our annual report from last year. And, you know, we have somebody sitting on this access forum, and we will make sure, because it's got to be not just for people attending the Commonwealth Games, it's got to be for the sports people who are going to be, I was going to say Paralympians, I don't mean, because it's not the Olympics, but you know what I mean. You know, that side of it. And it's also going to be, you know, for people who are volunteering as stewards and helpers, because not everybody, not everyone is able-bodied, and in fact there's very good examples in London in the Paralympics and in the Olympics where people with disabilities were actually stewards. And I mean, I think that's something we would want to encourage here, obviously. So it's got to be for everyone. It's got to be for the visitors, the sports people, and the people who are volunteering and working at the sites. But yes, I think things. My latest input is that things have improved. One of the problems that I think there's going to be is that they're saying there will be accessible buses. So they're going to have to get them from elsewhere. Now that can be a concern for where the accessible buses are and being removed so that they can operate in Glasgow or indeed the other 4 sites, leaving people who are used to accessible buses without any during the period of the Commonwealth Games. And I think that would not be good, because certainly one of the things I have picked up, and it's not, I mean, it wasn't a serious study, but certainly I picked up about the Olympics, was that people who were just going to work, not going to the Olympics, but going to work, who had a disability, found that things were, in some instances, were more difficult for them. And that would be a shame if that happened in Glasgow or at any of the 4 sites, especially if the only way to get accessible buses is to take them from elsewhere. I think that is a serious issue, which we are trying to address. As I've no doubt are other people on this accessibility group.
Okay, and is there anything that you think we haven't covered that you'd like to add, anybody?
No, I think you've covered our main areas of concern, and I thank the committee for the opportunity to do so.
Committee have any further questions? Well, can I thank you very much for your attendance today. The committee will follow up the issues raised in the context of our forthcoming work on transport issues, and in particular the rail transport, the next ScotRail franchise. And there are several things you've highlighted today that we'll take up with the Minister. But thank you again for coming. I'll briefly suspend to allow the witnesses to leave the room. Okay, agenda item 3, subordinate legislation. The item is consideration of the Roadworks Maintenance Scotland Amendment Regulations 2012. As outlined in paper 2, the instrument would enable emergency road improvements to be carried out following an inspection by a roads authority. Currently, legislation limits the grounds for which an inspection may be carried out. The instrument would remove these limitations. The committee is invited to consider any issues that it wishes to raise in reporting to Parliament on the instruments. Members should note that no motions to annul have been received in relation to this instrument. Does anyone have any comments? No. Is the committee agreed that it doesn't wish to make any recommendations in relation to this instrument? That is agreed. As agreed previously, we will take the remainder of our business in private, so I close the public part of this meeting.